If Walter White was corrupted, then the word has officially lost all meaning. Because nothing about this story is a decent man falling off a cliff. It's a resentful man finally getting a stage, a costume, and an audience willing to call it character development as long as he sounds confident doing it. And here's the part that should be embarrassing. The show practically trains viewers to applaud. Not because Walter becomes good, he doesn't. Because he becomes effective. He becomes certain. He becomes the kind of man who speaks like a verdict and smirks like that's proof. And somehow, that reads as strength instead of what it actually is, ego with a body count. So let's stop treating The Fly like a holy artifact about guilt and purity, while ignoring the rest of the series, where purity conveniently stops mattering the second the Empire needs momentum. When he's trapped under Gus, he obsesses over a speck of contamination. When he's in charge, he cooks in filth and calls it necessity. That isn't depth. That's a tell. This is the real question. If Walter was never corrupted, if he was unmasked, why did so many people clap when the mask came off? A certain kind of television alchemy happens when a series spends years insisting it is about consequence, control, and moral rot, and then watches its audience litigate, endlessly, whether a single insect was the real villain. Walter White swatting at a fly in an immaculate laboratory is treated as high symbolism, a clinical portrait of unraveling, an emblem of contamination anxiety, the sacred text of those who prefer metaphor to accountability. The sharper question is why that same interpretive discipline is so often withheld the moment the narrative cuts to far uglier forms of contamination. The Fly episode is not, in practice, a seminar on sterile technique. It is a display of compulsion. Walter does not lose his mind so much as he loses the illusion that he is steering. He is cornered by a boss who can replace or erase him, burdened by guilt and fear that seep into every conversation at home, and haunted by the suspicion that Jesse is siphoning product. When control collapses, perfection becomes a substitute for power. He cannot command the cartel, the clock, or his own conscience, so he chases the one thing he can pretend to manage: a speck of chaos inside a room built for precision. That is precisely why later cooks in compromised houses are not the same thing. They are the opposite. Those sequences are not a meditation on purity. They are an admission that purity no longer matters when momentum must be maintained. The operation is scrambling to keep revenue flowing, improvised and risk-tolerant, because the broader system is cracking. The houses are not cleaned first. They are used first. Only after the cook does anyone bother to fumigate, because the product has already been extracted, and the danger is now someone else's problem. It is not a philosophical contradiction. It is a moral one. Even the frequently cited parallel to Gustavo Fring, his escalating fastidiousness around fryer cleanliness as pressure mounts, reinforces the same thesis. Hyper-cleanliness is not always about hygiene. Sometimes it is an alibi. A man who expects law enforcement attention makes sure someone can vouch for his presence, his routine, and his conspicuous normalcy. The ritual can be coping mechanism, mask, and timestamp at once. Gus cleans because it calms him, and because it proves something. Walter cleans because he is drowning in consequences and wants a task that feels solvable. That pattern, contradiction packaged as complexity, then defended as coherence, defines Walter White. He is introduced as the meek chemistry teacher who cannot say no, cannot demand more, cannot even advocate for himself without apologizing. Then the series reveals boundless ambition, greed, and self-regard that appear to have been sleeping in a drawer for decades. Viewers are left to reconcile the man who walked away from a once-in-a-generation business opportunity with the man who will later risk everything to hear himself called indispensable. The simplest explanation is also the most damning. The ego was never absent. It was merely contained by circumstance and insecurity. Walter did not become prideful. He became unshackled. Years of feeling small, professionally, socially, romantically, did not produce humility. They produced resentment. When illness arrives, it does not create a new person. It removes the last excuse to remain the old one. Staring death in the face can inspire tenderness. It can also inspire a man to decide the universe owes him a standing ovation for surviving his own disappointment. That is why the gray matter question refuses to stay buried. What kind of person helps build something extraordinary, gets bought out, and then spends years nursing the grievance like a treasured heirloom? The most persuasive reading is that Walter left because he felt inferior, not only to a partner's talent, but to a partner's class, family, and effortless belonging in rooms where he always felt like a guest. The idea that a holiday weekend with a wealthy family could detonate a relationship is not trivial melodrama. It is the origin story of a pride so fragile, it requires decades of revenge fantasies to stay intact. A key flashback makes the insecurity more pointed. A younger, more confident Walter, dissecting the chemistry of the human body with Gretchen, only for her to mention that the missing piece is the soul. It is tender and slightly naive, and it exposes what will later curdle into grievance. Walter's craving to be seen, not merely as correct, but as essential. When that craving is not satisfied, he does not adjust. He audits the world for theft. This is where the nice guy mythology collapses. Walter is not a gentle soul corrupted by necessity. He is a resentful man constrained by timidity. Strength does not arrive as moral clarity. It arrives as permission. He becomes bold enough to pursue what he always wanted. And what he always wanted was not peace. It was recognition. His closest narrative cousin is Chuck McGill, another man who drapes insecurity in principle, brands himself the guardian of standards, and then acts astonished when the world refuses to reward him for being aggrieved. Inferiority does not remain a private ache. It metastasizes into a governing logic. Walter refuses a rescue offer not because the money is tainted, but because charity denies him credit. Better to gamble his family's future than accept help that would remind him, daily, that another man could have saved him. Better to build an empire than to admit he once made a mistake and could be spared its consequences. Pride is visible from the beginning in the refusal to accept help, the resentment toward former partners, the need to be the indispensable expert in any room, and the simmering conviction that every slight is an intellectual crime. In that light, the romantic history is not sentimental backstory. It is a blueprint. Walter's true love reads less like affection and more like validation. He gravitates toward relationships that preserve his superiority and recoils from those that threaten it. The claim that he settled for Skylar, described as younger and working a service job when they met, sounds harsh, but it aligns with his later behavior. He struggles to tolerate equals. He prefers partners who can be managed. Consider the professional analog. Gail Bedecker is gifted, earnest, and competent, and therefore unusable. A partner who can meet Walter on the intellectual field cannot be bent as easily, so a pretext is found, a flaw exaggerated, and the partnership redirected back to Jesse Pinkman, the more pliable option. Jesse is simultaneously indispensable and disposable, needed to keep the machine running, and kept off balance so gratitude and fear can be harvested on demand. That is not mentorship. It is a control strategy dressed up as concern. This is why rewatching the series often transforms mild discomfort into open hostility. On an initial pass, Walter's cruelty can hide behind urgency, his manipulation behind strategy, his lies behind the genre's demand for suspense. On subsequent viewings, the pattern hardens. The gaslighting is no longer a narrative mechanism. It is a governing practice. Family scenes stop reading as domestic complications and start reading as containment. A spouse cornered, a child confused, and a man insisting that his domination is actually love with better marketing. Season 5 makes the diagnosis particularly easy. By then, the performance of competence has inflated into smug entitlement. Walter's attempt to emulate Gus Fring produces a parody: posture without discipline, arrogance without operational calm. Gus had business acumen, management skill, and a chilling steadiness that made violence feel like policy. Walter has a grin and a speech. He needs Mike Ehrmantraut for infrastructure, contacts, and adult supervision, and yet behaves as though everyone else is a subcontractor hired to validate his legend. The relentless machismo posturing is the giveaway. Walter speaks and smirks like a man trying to prove he is the dominant figure in every room, as if authority were earned through tone and facial expression. Collaboration is proposed, and he treats it as an insult. A car ride debate about taking a vote ends with Walter's amused "why?", which tells everyone exactly how much their input matters. The power dynamic is central. Under Gus, Walter is constrained, and that constraint helps explain the obsessive spirals: the fly, the fixation, the compulsive need to fix something tiny when he cannot fix anything real. He is reeling from guilt and fear, and from the knowledge that he is dispensable. Later, once Gus is dead and the pest control operation is underway, Walter acts with the confidence of a man who believes agency absolves him. He no longer flinches at contamination, moral or environmental, because he has convinced himself that winning is the same as being right. Meanwhile, collateral damage accumulates with the quiet persistence of a chemical burn. Walter watches Jane die, choosing inaction that functions as murder. He coerces and terrorizes his wife, including a scene that is difficult to interpret as anything but sexual assault. He poisons a child to manipulate an ally. He uses children as props in adult warfare. He contributes to Hank's death through choices that make escalation inevitable, and then performs grief as if grief were a defense. The show does not need to shout these facts. It simply shows them, then watches viewers negotiate which ones count. And yet, because the narrative is structurally committed to following him, the audience is repeatedly invited to negotiate with these realities. The show offers plausible self-justifications at every turn, protecting the family, preserving a partner, avoiding a boss's wrath, ensuring survival. Some motives are intermittently sincere. Walter can care about his family and still exploit them. He can protect Jesse in one moment and brutalize him in the next. Complexity does not cleanse. It merely explains how a person talks himself into feeling heroic while behaving like a threat. This is where popular analysis tends to collapse into two equally lazy camps. On one side, Walter as pure evil, inherently rotten, destined to become a monster. On the other, Walter as misunderstood anti-hero, fundamentally decent, with atrocities exaggerated by sanctimonious observers. Both positions flatten the text. Both serve emotional convenience rather than interpretation. The internet has been oversimplifying complex subjects since the day it learned to load a comment box. This story is simply one of its more expensive victims. The always evil theory is tempting because it makes the story tidy. If Walter was secretly vile in the pilot, then early sympathy becomes a viewer's moral error to be corrected, not a deliberate seduction by the writers. But the series is explicitly about change, about a man who cries over his first killing and later authorizes executions with administrative indifference. To insist that episode 1 Walter was simply Heisenberg in a cardigan is to erase the journey and to miss the warning. People do not need to be monsters in secret to become monsters in public. At the same time, the ego is overstated defense often functions as selective blindness. Pride is visible from the beginning in the refusal to accept help from former colleagues, the simmering resentment toward anyone with status, and the need to be the indispensable expert in any room. Self-preservation drives many early decisions, yes, but self-preservation is not a synonym for virtue. A man can be cornered and still choose cruelty as his preferred tool. He can be frightened and still enjoy the feeling of power he claims he never wanted. The more credible reading is that Walter's motives are braided. Protective instinct exists alongside vanity. Fear coexists with appetite. Loyalty is real until it becomes inconvenient. When he offers enormous sums to spare Hank, the gesture may be genuine, and it may also be the last attempt to purchase a narrative where empire building can still be sold as family provision. Even the infamous phone call meant to shield Skylar is both performance and confession. He is capable of sacrifice, and he is also addicted to writing the script in which he gets credit for it. This ambivalence is not a flaw to be resolved. It is the mechanism. The problem is what audiences do with it. For years, Walter was treated as an icon of masculine competence, the genius who outwits everyone, the man who refuses to be pushed around, the provider who does what he must. In response, a cultural overcorrection has emerged. The insistence that any neutral observation about him is apologetics, and any appreciation of his narrative function is endorsement of his ethics. Nuance becomes a loyalty test, and loyalty becomes a substitute for thinking. The result is a peculiar morality play, where politeness is mistaken for virtue. Some elevate Gus above Walter because Gus is courteous while ordering murder, as if tone were a substitute for humanity. Others condemn Walter more harshly because he is rude to Jesse, while granting indulgence to characters whose body counts are higher, but whose manners are better. Civility is not morality, it is branding. A well-tailored suit does not convert a criminal enterprise into a public service, and a polite voice does not make an execution humane. This is also why Mike Ehrmantraut becomes a lightning rod. He is admired for competence, mourned for restraint, quoted for weary realism, but his good death is, on inspection, a bitter joke. Shot, collapsing, leaving a granddaughter behind, spending his last moments listening to Walter explain why the killing was unnecessary. To call that dignified is to confuse stoicism with justice. Mike is not a saint. He is a professional criminal with one sentimental attachment that helps him pretend his work is a grim civic duty, rather than a choice he made again and again. Similarly, Jesse Pinkman's role as the audience's conscience is complicated by his own choices. He is victimized, manipulated, and used, often by Walter, but he also pursues profit, endangers vulnerable people, and makes decisions that are not simply reactions to abuse. His flirtation with selling poison to a recovery community is a reminder that suffering does not automatically confer innocence. The story is not a courtroom where one must declare a single defendant. It is a system in which nearly everyone compromises, then insists their compromise was the understandable one. Even Hank Schrader, often reevaluated more favorably on rewatch, is not framed as a pure counterweight. He bends rules in pursuit of his quarry, performs bravado as identity, and weaponizes obsession under the banner of justice. And the series quietly reminds viewers that moral gradations exist even in the normal household. Underage beer schemes, sharp rudeness, and performative virtue that comes with enjoying forbidden cigars while condemning other people's vices. The point is gradation, and Walter's is catastrophic. Then there is Skylar White, the character who exposes the audience's most reliable blind spot, the tendency to hate whichever figure interrupts the protagonist's momentum, regardless of whether that interruption is sane. Skylar is not written as extraordinary. She is written as human, sometimes resilient, sometimes reactive, sometimes wrong. Her mistakes are visible because the camera lingers on domestic consequence, while Walter's larger societal harm is abstracted into off-screen statistics. She becomes the target because she refuses to play along with the fantasy that the man lying to her is doing it for her benefit. The notion that the series is about a good man forced to cook meth to provide is a marketing pitch, not an accurate synopsis. The story is about a frustrated man who finds in criminality the first arena where his brilliance is applauded, and then chooses applause over ethics. It is about a man who claims the mantle of provider while systematically destroying the family he insists he is saving. If the early seasons feel like an argument rather than a triumph, that is not a mismatch of expectations. It is the show quietly insisting that admiration should not be automatic. This is why the thought experiment, what if Walter were thoroughly pleasant while making the same choices, lands with grim simplicity. A pleasant criminal in that world does not become a beloved entrepreneur. He becomes a corpse. Politeness is not armor when violence is policy. The series remains compelling because Walter is entertaining. Fascination is not admiration, and enjoyment is not a moral contract. The writing invites viewers to understand a villain, then tests whether they can stop confusing centrality with worth. Walter's charisma is the bait. The aftermath is the lesson. And it is not flattering for anyone watching. The most revealing debates are the ones that attempt to quantify who is worse between Walter and the other criminals. Gus builds an efficient empire and orders killings with corporate composure. Saul monetizes harm with a salesman's grin. Mike enforces violence with paternal resignation. Walter commits atrocities and then demands credit for his intentions. To claim one is categorically better because he is calm, or because he seems more professional, is to miss the franchise's bleak conclusion. Competence can make evil look orderly, not less evil. There is, admittedly, an argument that Walter is not disloyal so much as realistic. He does not owe Tuco loyalty when Tuco intends to enslave him. He does not owe Gus loyalty when Gus threatens his family. But that defense often skips an inconvenient detail. Survival instincts may explain rebellion, but they do not explain relish. Over time, Walter's choices expand far beyond what is required to live. He does not simply escape captivity, he builds a throne. He does not merely protect loved ones, he uses protection as a permanent authorization slip for whatever he wants next. The most practical tragedies are the ones that could have been avoided by basic restraint. The story contains multiple off-ramps. Accept financial help. Walk away. Take a profit and stop. Sell the methylamine and retire. Instead, Walter repeatedly chooses the path that keeps his ego fed. Even the book that exposes him feels like thematic comedy. The man who can calculate chemistry at genius level cannot imagine that vanity might be cataloged on a bathroom shelf. The reveal is so mundane, it borders on satire. Years of elaborate concealment undone by the arrogance of thinking the world exists to admire his footprint.